So as you probably guessed, the first thing you should do as an architect is to define the requirements. These requirements are very important for your work and they dictate what the architecture will look like. Okay, so let's do that. You probably remember there are two types of requirements: functional requirements and non-functional requirements. The functional requirements state what the system should do, while the non-functional requirements define what the system should deal with. Now, the functional requirements are well defined in this case. It looks like the system analysts did a good job and it's quite clear what the system should do. Let's summarize the functional requirements in a short bulleted list. 1. Receive status updates from IoT devices. 2. Store these updates for future use. And 3. Allow end users to query the updates and present them with the relevant information. So far, so good. Now, let's go to the more interesting part, the non-functional requirements. Now, before we continue, I would like you to take a moment and to think, what are the relevant non-functional requirements for this system? What we must know as architects that can influence the architecture? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. I'll even put some relaxing music for you, and I want you to write down the questions you need to ask the customer in order to figure out the non-functional requirements. Feel free to pause the lecture and take as much time as you need. Write down the questions and then hit resume. Okay, great. Welcome back. So, what are the questions we need to ask the customer? Well, here they are. First and foremost, since the system is going to receive messages from an IoT devices, we should expect there will be a lot of messages. Now, the number of messages has great effect on the system design, and it will help us know these crucial non-functional factors. The load, how many concurrent messages we should expect. Data volume, how many messages should be stored in the system's data store. These factors are translated into two questions we need to ask. First, how many concurrent messages should the system expect in peak time? And second, what is the total number of expected messages per month? In addition, to make our calculations more accurate, we should also ask, what is the average size of a message? Now, we can assume the client will need some time to figure out the answers to these questions, so let's skip a few days forward and then we will get a response, which is this. Max concurrent messages, 500. Total number of messages per month, 15 million. Average message size, 300 bytes. Okay, great. Now we have something to work with. Let's open calculator and do some math. 15 million messages per month with average size of 300 bytes per message give us roughly 4,500 megabytes per month. Let's multiply this by 12 to get the yearly number, and we are looking at 54 gigabytes per year. This is good, since 54 gigabytes in today's storage is not a lot, and almost every database can handle it easily. And by that, we're calculating the data volume non-functional requirement, which is 54 gigabytes annually. Now, note that I assume the retention policy here is infinite, meaning data is never archived or deleted. In data-intensive application, this is usually not the case, and data can expire. In our application, this is not the case. So the data volume non-functional requirement looks like a non-issue. The load, however, is a completely different story. With 500 concurrent messages, this is a quite busy system. We will have to find a way to cope with this number, since a regular web application will have a hard time under this load. Of course, we can always scale out and add dozens of servers, but that's not always possible. We will prefer to design the system such that the software itself will be able to work properly under such a load. So the load non-functional requirement is set, and it is 500 concurrent messages. As we will see later, the number is slightly higher, but we will leave it this way for now. Okay, next. Next thing we need to know is how tolerant is the system for message loss. In other words, if not every message is received and some are lost due to network problems or other errors, is that a problem? Now, the first instinct is always to answer, sure, we cannot lose any message, but let's think about it. This system receives status updates. Each device sends update every few seconds. What really happens when a message is lost? Not much actually. A few seconds later, another message will arrive with new update, which will anyway make the previous message obsolete. So when thinking about it, the system is quite tolerant for messages loss. No harm is done if a message is lost, and chances are the user will not even feel that. Now, of course, we are not talking here on a system-wide catastrophe that drops all messages, but on a rare cases that might result a single loss for every 1,000 successfully received messages. So the message loss non-functional requirement can be defined as 99%. Note that in this kind of non-functional requirement, there is a huge difference between 100% and 99%. It may look like a small difference, only a single digit, but it actually makes all the difference, as we will see later. Okay, next. The next question we need to ask is, how many users will the system have, and how many concurrent users should we expect? These questions are similar to the first questions asked about the messages, and they serve the same purpose. They help us assess the expected load and data volume of the system. However, we can expect the numbers to be much lower than the number of the messages, since there are much more devices than users, and the users do not query the system every few seconds. And the numbers we get from the client reflect just that. The client expects the system to have a total of 2 million users 3 years from now, with no more than 40 concurrent users. Now, it's important to understand what concurrent users mean. It does not mean how many users are currently using the system, but rather how many users are actively accessing the server. This distinction is important. When a user looks at the dashboard, he uses the system, but does not access the server. The dashboard is already on the user's screen, so the server does nothing. When calculating load, we are interested only in the actual work the server is doing, so we define concurrent users as a number of users that actually access the server on the same time. And since most users won't just sit by their PC or phone and hammer the server in their free time, we can comfortably assume quite a low number of concurrent users. And that's the reason the concurrent user number is only 40. And that makes the load non-functional requirement to be 540. That's the 500 concurrent messages plus the 40 users' actions. The last question we need to ask is, what is the SLA required for this system? Or in other words, what is the maximum downtime allowed for this system? Now, instinctively, most clients will say that they expect 100% uptime. Problem is, this is not possible. Even the largest, most sophisticated data centers in the world do not commit to 100% uptime. Crashes are part of the software world, and we should accept that. So we need to have a more realistic figure. Now, it's also important to note that an SLA is comprised from not only software. There are a lot of factors that affect it, such as hardware, network, database servers, virtualization engines, and more. Usually you, the architect, will have no control over these factors, and you have to clarify this to the customer. I remember one client of mine that always talked about the high SLA he demanded. I then asked for a meeting with the database team to find out what is the SLA they commit to. To my and his surprise, not only the team could not commit to any SLA, they didn't even know what an SLA is. Remember this when discussing SLA figures with the client. What I usually do is define 3 levels of SLA: silver, gold, and platinum, and ask the client which level he requires for the software. Platinum level, which is what most of the clients choose, dictates that the system should be fully stateless, easily scaled out, and utilize extensive logging and monitoring. There is no point in discussing specific uptime numbers such as 97% versus 99%. There are so many other factors that make this number meaningless. I highly recommend adopting the 3 SLA levels method and using it with your client. It is up to you to decide what is included in each level and what is the impact on the development time and cost, but make sure you have this definition in place. So, in our case, since the system shows live status updates, the client defined it as a platinum system, which means it should have all the characteristics of a reliable and redundant system. So, to conclude, here are the non-functional requirements defined for this system. We walked through the exact flow of figuring them out, and they are now fully documented. I want to emphasize again the importance of accurate non-functional requirements. As we will see later in this section, these requirements have great influence on the architecture and should be thoroughly discussed and documented. Modifying non-functional requirement after the project has begun is always a bad idea. Okay, great. So we have the requirements of the project. Let's move on.